Our next topic is how commercial real estate and the government interact. Because real estate is difficult to move and has a lot of uniqueness, oftentimes real estate has become very, very political. In fact, you have political philosophies that have even been developed around commercial estate. If you don't recognize the individual on this slide, this is Karl Marx, and he was one of the writers of the Communist Manifesto. And this is one of his sayings from the Communist Manifesto. He said, "Step one is the abolishment of property and land, and application of all rents of land to public purposes." And so what this means is if we had a hypothetical shopping center in our society, the rents that the tenants pay would go to the individual owner. But what Karl Marx sort of professes as a better model is that the tenants continue to pay, but they pay the government. And that would allow the government to enjoy the benefits of that income and also have a much greater say in the services that the society has or that community has, basically through the tenant selection. Now, obviously, we don't live in a communist society, but there are limitations to ownership of commercial real estate in our sort of market-based model. Now, if you take a look there's a table on this slide, and the limitations I've grouped into two different buckets. The first is government, that's the top row, and then the private sector is the bottom row. Now, we've talked about the private sector limitations in a couple of lectures ago in the form of liens. They're basically non-possessory interests in real estate. So we've got liens, we have deed restrictions, and then easements and leases. This topic here, we're going to talk about governmental restrictions, typically or most likely in the form of eminent domain, the police regulatory powers, and taxation. So one of the reasons why government has felt it needed to step into the real estate market and to put limitations on ownership is that real estate is unique, and oftentimes some of this uniqueness results in items that are difficult for the market to be able to price or to factor into a value. And the three things that typically make real estate unique and are difficult for the market to factor into values are externalities, incomplete information, and location monopoly. And so just to give you an example of a couple of these, an externality is sort of an unintended consequence of something. So if you had a development that had 100 new houses that was being developed, these 100 new residents would cause more traffic jams on the roads, more wear and tear on the roads. There would be a greater number of children in the community schools, and that might result in larger classroom sizes and a lower quality of education for the kids. So even though we know that would happen through subdivision development, it's very difficult for the market to be able to price what exactly this cost is. From an incomplete information perspective, oftentimes when you take a look at a property, it's very, very difficult to tell how safe it is. Every year we read in the newspaper or hear about stories where some building has fallen down and it takes people completely by surprise because you just can't tell the safety and soundness of a property just by looking at the exterior of it. And lastly, this is something we talked about a couple lectures ago about location monopoly. If a government, as an example, wants to build a road and it needs 10 different parcels, if you get to the middle parcel, you've obtained, or the government has been able to purchase 9 out of the 10. You've got the middle parcel that still needs to be built to be able to connect the road. The individual who owns that doesn't have to sell, or might not want to sell because they have a location monopoly, and they might charge or ask just a really, really high price. So because of this location monopoly, the government has had to come up with different alternatives to face these unique things. So the authority of state and local governments to regulate land use and enforce development and construction standards is vested in its police power and is concerned with public safety. So if you think back to the 4 powers that our society has given to our government that we do not have as individuals, police power is one, taxation is another, eminent domain, which is something we're going to talk about in a couple slides, is the 3rd power, which basically is the power to take land from an individual. And the last power is the power of escheat, which has to do with when people die and they have an estate. If they don't have a will, then basically the state assumes control of all those assets. So of all 4 of those powers we've given our government that individuals don't have, the majority of the limitations come from the policing power and are really focused on trying to make a safer public space. Almost all county and civil governments use some sort of combination of building codes, zoning, and planning to regulate the use of land. So to talk briefly about building codes. So building codes were the earliest use of the police power to regulate land use. It's well accepted now, and particularly in the urban environment, design and materials of structures were an important concern for public safety. So for example, you want to make sure that you were using strong enough materials like steel to build buildings. No longer do you build buildings typically with wood because there's a fire hazard. You also want to make sure that sanitation is up to par so you don't cause an outbreak of disease. So that's usually manifests itself in plumbing and water codes for each of the different buildings. And then you also have issues of injury. You just want to make sure, like for instance, in areas that are prone to earthquakes, they have special type of building structures that need to be made to cushion the shaking of earthquakes. In part, these codes are trying to help prevent or minimize damage from natural disasters, for example, hurricanes, fires, tornadoes. Zoning is the second type of limitation imposed by the government. Zoning ordinances have been a core approach to land use regulation since about 1920s in the United States. Existing land uses that fall outside of new zoning classifications are called non-conforming uses. So this happens all the time. You'll have a building that was built a little while ago, and through maybe there's a technology change in building, or the weather changes, or you get a different political party in, they want to make things better, so they change the code. That doesn't mean that somebody who has a building that no longer is up to code needs to go out and change it. They basically are grandfathered in his existing state, and that's called a non-conforming use. The zoning ordinance also have got to provide relief for cases where regulations impose an exceptional hardship or loss of value. This is typically called a variance. And oftentimes, if you buy a property, let's say it's zoned for apartments, but you want to put a retail space in there, you'll have to go to the zoning board at your local county or local government office and ask for a variance. That basically says, I know this is zoned only for apartments, but we want to build a retail space here. So both the zoning laws and their specific applications have been attacked as confiscation of property without compensation. So just when cities actually enact these zoning or even building codes, oftentimes you aren't able to use as an owner the land like you want to, and people feel that, hey, I need to be compensated if you're going to say I can't use the land for what I want to use it for. So this right here is a picture of Lebanon, Ohio's zoning map. You can see all the different colors, and each of the different colors represents a different zoning group. So you'll have different colors. Some represent, okay, only residential is allowed to be built here. Another color will be, this is all where commercial is. Then maybe a third color will be where all the industrial warehouses or plants are located, and retail, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll get a zoning map, and inside the zoning map, once you find out what the classification is, whether it's residential or commercial, it will tell you, it will have a bunch of requirements. So sometimes if you have like single family housing zone, the house has to be set back at least 20 feet from the road. You have to be at least 50 feet from your neighbors on each side. So those are called setback requirements. Sometimes you have density limits. Um, you're not allowed, and this is the big thing, because the denser you could make land, the more profitable it becomes. And by density, it means you can just add more space, or from an apartment perspective, you can add more units, or more rooms. But oftentimes the city controls the density through their zoning code. And also they have, through the zoning code, special use districts. So they'll have a special district maybe for where hospitals are located, or schools, cemeteries, and again, all those areas will have their own sort of requirements that need to be followed to be in to comply with the zoning code. If you don't comply with zoning code, typically the city will fine you and then make you change your property to meet the code. So from a zoning subdivision perspective, virtually every local government has adopted regulations that govern the creation of subdivisions. The purpose of these regulations is to promote the proper arrangement and coordination of streets in relation to existing or planned streets, and certainly recently to assure coordination of subdivisions with the local comprehensive plan. So one reason for the review by a variety of officials is that roadways and utilities and subdivisions are often dedicated to the local governments, which basically means the local governments are responsible to maintain them. So they want to make sure that they're up to code, that they can handle the capacity of this new subdivision, because if they can't, or if they're of low quality, then basically that community, usually through increased taxes, is responsible to maintain them. So I've got a couple examples on the slide. They want to make sure that there's adequate drainage for runoff when rain or storm comes. You want to make sure you have open public spaces. Another way government restricts or limits our power as individual owners of commercial estate is through planning. Now, before the 1960s or 1970s, the general societal perception of the earth was that it was an endless and costless resource that you could just tap into anytime you wanted. But the 1960s and 70s came along, and people started to believe that, well, wait a minute, this might not be, we might have limited resources, and this notion of we're a spaceship Earth, which is a closed system with limited clean air, clean water, and space. So we need to basically take care of it. And one of the ways that they thought that they could take care of it was through planning. So the theory of public planning is that directed land uses from a community perspective is the best means of correcting the market failures. And again, the market failures we talked about were imperfect information, externalities, and location monopoly. So these planning and zoning boards were created, and they oversaw the implementation of local ordinances and considered requests for specific changes. Typically, the boards charge what are called impact fees, which are intended to compensate the communities for any negative externalities to a new development might create. So if you think of a new subdivision that's going to be built and has 100 new houses, that's going to increase traffic on all the roads. There might be a need for more lanes to be built on the roads, to go from a 2-lane highway to maybe like a 4-lane highway. So what the community does is they go through and see what the changes are that will be required to sort of keep the community at the level of service as it was with all these new people. They come up with a price or a cost for that, and then they hand that price or cost to the developer in the form of an impact fee and say, hey, listen, you can develop this 100 new units, but just know you're going to have to pay $120,000 in impact fees to help us basically widen the roads, deal with any sort of storm runoff, et cetera, et cetera. So again, other planning issues. So the aspect of a centralized land use planning is the implied need for centralized authority. So we're talking about basically communism again. But is this just human arrogance to believe that a small group of individuals knows better than the market? A consensus of what a best practice for land use has not really been determined, partly because of lack of data concerning the true extent of various externalities or the effect of various remedies. So, for example, which is better when you're planning roads, to do grid-like streets or to do cul-de-sacs? Should you separate property types, like all the apartments here, right next to all the retail and all next to all the warehouses, or do you allow mixed use? How much mass transit is appropriate? So some concerns about this centralized planning or this authority is, do these costs increase because of zoning? Does zoning interfere with the preferred and efficient land use? For example, would people prefer to have a small retail presence right inside their community, or do they want it to have to drive to the mall down the road? And lastly, there's a worry that zoning actually exacerbates urban sprawl.